The coffee cup shattered against the diner floor as Maria Santos watched three leather-clad men push through the entrance of Eddie's Corner Cafe. Their heavy boots crushed the ceramic fragments while their cold eyes swept across the morning crowd like predators selecting prey. The elderly man reading his newspaper in booth 7 suddenly found his hands trembling. The young mother feeding her toddler scrambled eggs instinctively pulled her child closer. Even Eddie himself, a former linebacker who'd never backed down from anyone, took an unconscious step toward the register where he kept his baseball bat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But Maria simply picked up another pot of coffee and continued her rounds as if nothing had changed. Her worn sneakers navigated around the broken pieces with practiced ease, while her free hand smoothed down her faded blue uniform. To everyone watching, she appeared to be the same timid waitress who'd served their morning coffee for the past 8 years. The woman who blushed when customers complimented her apple pie. The one who stammered apologies when orders ran late. The quiet soul who'd never raised her voice above a whisper, even when dealing with the rudest patrons. None of them could have imagined that Maria Santos had once been known by a very different name in very different circles. That she'd walk through places where broken coffee cups were the least of anyone's worries. That she'd face down men far more dangerous than 3 small-town thugs looking to shake down a family diner. The morning had started like every other Wednesday in Millbrook, population 3,847, where the biggest excitement usually came from Mrs. Henderson's gossip about who was dating whom at the high school. Eddie's Corner Cafe sat on Main Street between Peterson's Hardware and the old barber shop that everyone still called Murphy's, even though Murphy had died 6 years ago. The breakfast rush brought the usual suspects. Construction workers grabbing coffee and donuts before heading to the highway project, retirees stretching their Social Security checks with the early bird special, and young professionals commuting to the county seat who couldn't afford the chain coffee shops. Maria had arrived at 5:30 that morning, same as always, using her own key to unlock the back door and start the coffee brewing before Eddie rolled in around 6. She'd worked this routine so long that her body moved through the tasks without conscious thought. Flip the switches for the grill and fryer. Check that the milk hadn't gone bad overnight. Count the register down to make sure yesterday's close had been accurate. Fill the napkin dispensers and ketchup bottles. Wipe down every surface until it gleamed under the fluorescent lights that hummed their familiar tune. Eddie Kowalski had inherited the diner from his uncle 22 years ago and had never quite figured out how to make it profitable. He was a good man with a generous heart, who extended credit to customers going through rough patches and never charged the homeless man who came in every few days looking for work in exchange for a meal. His cooking was solid if unspectacular, his prices fair, and his coffee strong enough to wake the dead. But running a business required skills that his engineering degree hadn't covered, and he'd been one bad month away from bankruptcy for the better part of a decade. That's where Maria had become invaluable. She'd quietly taken over the ordering, ensuring they never ran out of popular items while avoiding the waste that had plagued Eddie's early years. She'd implemented a reservation system for the Friday night fish fry that turned it from a chaotic free-for-all into the diner's most profitable evening. She'd suggested menu changes that increased margins without raising prices, like the daily soup special that used up ingredients that might otherwise spoil. Eddie had started to suspect that Maria understood business better than he did, but every time he tried to discuss promoting her to manager, she'd deflect the conversation with gentle but firm persistence. The truth was that Maria preferred her role in the background. Waitressing gave her the perfect cover to observe everyone who came and went while appearing completely harmless. She could listen to conversations, memorize faces, and track the subtle patterns that most people missed. Old habits from a previous life that she couldn't quite shake, even though she'd been trying to leave that world behind for nearly a decade. This morning's crowd included the usual Wednesday regulars. Tom Bradley, the mailman, sat at the counter reading yesterday's sports section while working through his usual order of 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and bacon crisp enough to snap. He'd been coming in 3 times a week since Maria started working there, and she'd learned that he was divorced, sent half his paycheck to his ex-wife for alimony, and had been saving up for 2 years to visit his daughter in California. His hands shook slightly from the medication he took for anxiety, and he always left exactly 15% tip calculated to the penny. Sarah Martinez occupied booth 3 with her 18-month-old son Danny, who was making a delightful mess with his scrambled eggs while practicing new words that only his mother could interpret. Sarah worked the overnight shift at the hospital in the county seat and stopped by the diner on her way home to decompress before trying to sleep during the day. Her husband deployed to Afghanistan 6 months ago, and the stress showed in the dark circles under her eyes and the way she jumped at unexpected sounds. She ordered the same thing every Wednesday: oatmeal with brown sugar and fresh fruit, orange juice, and coffee with extra cream. She always asked for the check early so she could leave quickly if Danny got fussy. Frank Morrison, no relation to the Pentagon security chief from another story entirely, held court at the large round table in the back corner where the retired crowd gathered every morning to solve the world's problems over endless refills of coffee. Frank had worked at the grain elevator for 43 years before retiring, and he possessed the kind of encyclopedic knowledge of local history that made him the unofficial town historian. He could tell you which families had farmed, which plots of land going back 5 generations, who had married whom in 1963, and exactly what the weather had been like during the blizzard of 1978. The other regulars at his table included Joe Brennan, the former fire chief, Pete Williams, who'd run the gas station until arthritis forced him to sell, and Harold Chen, the retired high school principal who still substituted occasionally when the regular teachers called in sick. These men had become Maria's informal intelligence network, though they had no idea they were providing her with information. Their conversations covered everything happening in Millbrook and the surrounding area. They knew which businesses were struggling, which teenagers were getting into trouble, which marriages were hitting rough patches, and which newcomers to town might not be what they seemed. They discussed local politics with the passion of men who'd lived through enough election cycles to recognize patterns. They debated the merits of the proposed shopping center that would bring chain stores to compete with local businesses. They worried about the increasing drug problems that were creeping into rural areas from the cities. Maria absorbed all of this information while refilling their coffee cups and clearing their plates. She filed away details that might seem insignificant to others but could prove important later. She'd learned long ago that the best intelligence often came from the most mundane conversations. People revealed secrets without realizing they were doing so, and patterns emerged when you paid attention to seemingly random events. The morning had been proceeding exactly according to routine until the 3 men in leather jackets walked through the front door. Maria recognized the type immediately, even though she'd never seen these particular individuals before. They moved with the swagger of men accustomed to intimidating others, their eyes scanning the room to catalog potential threats and advantages. The leader was a tall, lean man in his 30s with prison tattoos visible on his knuckles and neck. His companions were younger, maybe early 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested they were still proving themselves to their boss. The conversation at Frank's table died mid-sentence as the newcomers claimed the booth nearest the door. Other customers suddenly found their food more interesting than the neighbors they'd been chatting with moments before. The atmosphere in the diner shifted like a weather front moving through, bringing tension that everyone could feel but no one wanted to acknowledge. Eddie emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of pancakes for table 6, but he stopped short when he saw the 3 men. His face went pale as recognition flickered in his eyes. These weren't random troublemakers passing through town. They were here for a specific purpose, and Eddie seemed to understand what that purpose might be. Maria continued her rounds as if nothing had changed, but every sense was now hyper-alert. She cataloged the positions of all the customers, noting potential exit routes and objects that could be used as weapons if necessary. A coffee pot in her hand could become a scalding deterrent. The serving tray on the counter could serve as a shield or striking weapon. The large pepper shaker at table 5 contained enough irritant to temporarily blind an attacker. Her mind automatically calculated distances and angles, while her body maintained the appearance of a nervous waitress going about her duties. The leader of the 3 men finally spoke, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that was often more effective than shouting. He called Eddie over with a gesture that looked casual but brooked no argument. Eddie set down the pancakes and walked over on unsteady legs, his hands unconsciously clenching and unclenching at his sides. The conversation between Eddie and the leather-jacketed man was conducted in tones too low for most customers to hear, but Maria's trained ear caught enough fragments to understand the situation. Words like protection and monthly payment and unfortunate incidents painted a clear picture. This was a shakedown, plain and simple. The kind of small-town extortion that had become increasingly common as organized crime expanded its reach beyond urban centers. Eddie's responses were barely audible, but his body language told the whole story. His shoulders sagged as he realized he was facing a problem he couldn't solve with hard work or good intentions. The diner that had been his life's work, the business that employed 6 people and served as a community gathering place, was being threatened by forces beyond his control. The other customers sensed the tension without understanding its source. Conversations became stilted and whispered. People finished their meals more quickly than usual, leaving tips on tables and heading for the door without the usual pleasantries. Frank Morrison's table cleared out entirely, the retired men suddenly remembering appointments they needed to keep. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah Martinez gathered up Danny in his diaper bag, shooting worried glances toward the booth by the door as she hurried past. Within 15 minutes, the diner had emptied except for Maria, Eddie, and the 3 unwelcome visitors. The morning rush that usually lasted until 9:30 had ended abruptly at 8:15, leaving behind half-eaten meals and abandoned newspapers. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the humming of the coffee makers and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Eddie returned to behind the counter, his face ashen and his hands shaking as he poured himself a cup of coffee he didn't want. The 3 men remained in their booth, making no move to order anything but clearly planning to stay as long as necessary to make their point. They were sending a message not just to Eddie but to anyone else who might be watching. This was their territory now, and resistance would be met with consequences. Maria continued her cleaning routine, wiping down empty tables and refilling salt shakers that didn't need attention. To any observer, she appeared to be the same timid waitress who'd worked there for 8 years. Someone so unremarkable that she barely registered as a presence in the room. Her movements were unhurried and precise, betraying none of the calculations running through her mind. She was thinking about the layout of the building, the positions of the men, the weapons they might be carrying, and the innocent people who might be affected by whatever was about to happen. She was considering options and contingencies, running through scenarios with the kind of tactical precision that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as the quiet woman who remembered how everyone liked their coffee. But mostly she was thinking about Eddie, the man who'd given her a job when she desperately needed to disappear into anonymity, who'd never asked questions about her past or why someone with her obvious intelligence was content to work for minimum wage plus tips, who'd covered her shifts without complaint when she disappeared for 3 days the previous winter to deal with what she'd described as a family emergency, but which had actually involved neutralizing a threat that had tracked her to Millbrook. Eddie Kowalski was a good man in a world that often punished goodness. He'd built something valuable in this small corner of the world, a place where people could gather and find comfort in simple pleasures like perfectly brewed coffee and homemade pie. He employed high school students saving for college, single mothers trying to make ends meet, and older workers who'd been cast aside by other employers. He was the kind of person who made communities work, and he deserved protection from predators who contributed nothing but fear. The leader of the 3 men finally stood up from the booth, his movement deliberate and threatening. He walked toward the counter where Eddie stood, each step calculated to maximize intimidation. His companions remained seated but shifted their positions to get better views of the room, their eyes constantly moving between Eddie and the front door. Eddie gripped his coffee cup with both hands to stop them from shaking as the man approached. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning that kept the diner comfortable even on this warm September morning. He'd been in difficult situations before, had faced down angry customers and dealt with suppliers who tried to cheat him, but this was different. This was the kind of danger that could destroy everything he'd built and put innocent people at risk. The conversation that followed was brief and devastating. The man laid out terms that were designed to be impossible to meet while sounding almost reasonable. A weekly protection fee that would absorb most of the diner's profits. Additional charges for special events like the Friday fish fry. Penalties for late payments that would compound into insurmountable debt. The classic structure of organized crime extortion, refined over decades to ensure that victims remained trapped once they agreed to the initial terms. Eddie tried to negotiate, his voice cracking as he explained that the diner barely broke even most months. He offered to pay something, anything, if they would just leave his customers alone. But the man wasn't interested in negotiation. This wasn't about money, not really. It was about establishing control, demonstrating power, and sending a message to other business owners in the area. The conversation ended with an ultimatum. Eddie had 48 hours to come up with the first payment. If he refused or tried to involve law enforcement, there would be consequences. The man didn't specify what those consequences might be, but his meaning was clear. People could get hurt. The diner could suffer unfortunate accidents. Eddie's employees might find themselves targeted. As the three men prepared to leave, the leader paused at the door and looked back at Maria, who was still cleaning tables with mechanical precision. For a moment, their eyes met across the empty diner. What he saw there should have warned him that he'd made a critical error in judgment. But like so many predators, he was blinded by his own assumptions about power and weakness. He saw a middle-aged waitress in a faded uniform, someone so insignificant that she wasn't worth acknowledging as a potential threat. He missed the calculating intelligence behind her nervous smile, the coiled tension in her seemingly relaxed posture, and the way her position gave her clear sightlines to every part of the room. He dismissed her as completely as everyone else had for the past 8 years, never suspecting that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his criminal career. After the three men left, Eddie slumped against the counter as if his strings had been cut. The coffee cup slipped from his nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the silent diner like a gunshot. He stared at the broken pieces for a long moment, seeing in them a reflection of his own shattered hopes and dreams. Maria moved quietly to his side, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her touch was warm and reassuring, the gesture of someone who understood loss and disappointment. She didn't offer empty platitudes or false hope. Instead, she simply stood with him in his moment of despair, providing the kind of human connection that mattered more than words. When Eddie finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. He tried to explain what had just happened, though they both knew she'd heard enough to understand the situation. He talked about the diner's history, about his uncle's legacy, about the employees who depended on their jobs. He worried about the customers who used the diner as their social center, the high school students who came in after games, the travelers who stopped for directions and stayed for pie. Maria listened without interrupting, her expression sympathetic but unreadable. She let him exhaust himself with words before speaking in the same soft voice she'd used for 8 years. She told him not to worry, that sometimes problems had a way of resolving themselves. She suggested he go home early, spend time with his wife, and try not to think about the situation until tomorrow. Eddie wanted to protest that there was no solution, that men like those who'd just left didn't simply disappear. But something in Maria's tone stopped him. There was a quality to her voice that he'd never heard before, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with her usual timid demeanor. For the first time since the morning's confrontation, he felt a flicker of hope that he couldn't quite explain. As Eddie gathered his things and prepared to leave, Maria began her closing routine, even though it was only mid-morning. She moved through the tasks with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, but there was a purpose to her actions that went beyond normal cleaning. She was preparing the space for something, though Eddie couldn't have guessed what that something might be. The last thing Eddie saw before leaving was Maria standing behind the counter, her hands resting lightly on the surface, where she'd served thousands of cups of coffee over the years. The late morning sun streaming through the front windows caught the silver threads in her dark hair, and for just a moment, she looked like someone entirely different from the shy waitress he thought he knew. Something was about to change in Millbrook, though the town's residents wouldn't understand what was happening until it was already over. The three men who'd walked into Eddie's Corner Cafe that morning believed they'd identified an easy target, a defenseless business owner who would pay their extortion demands rather than risk confrontation. They had no way of knowing that their simple shakedown had awakened something that had been sleeping peacefully for 8 years. Maria Santos had spent nearly a decade building a quiet life in a small town where her past couldn't follow her. She'd found peace in the routine of serving coffee and pie, in the simple pleasure of knowing her customers' names and preferences, in the satisfaction of helping Eddie's business succeed. She'd told herself that she was done with violence, that she'd earned the right to fade into anonymity and leave her former life behind. But some things couldn't be left behind completely. Training that had been burned into her bones through years of life-and-death situations. Instincts that had kept her alive in places where hesitation meant death. Skills that she'd hoped never to use again, but which remained as sharp as the day she'd walked away from her former life. The three men had made a fatal error in threatening the one place where Maria had found genuine happiness. They'd crossed a line that she couldn't allow to stand unchallenged. Eddie's Corner Cafe wasn't just her workplace. It was her sanctuary, her community, her chance at redemption. And she would protect it with the same ruthless efficiency that had once made her name whispered in fear in certain circles. As the morning sun climbed higher over Millbrook, casting longer shadows through the diner's windows, Maria began to plan. She thought about the three men, their vehicle, their likely base of operations, and the network they represented. She considered the resources available to her, the contacts she could still call upon, and the methods that would be most effective while drawing the least attention. The shy waitress who'd served coffee for 8 years was about to remind the world that some people chose invisibility not because they were weak, but because they were too dangerous to be seen clearly. The transformation would be subtle at first, noticeable only to those who knew what to look for. But before long, 3 men would learn that they'd made the mistake of threatening someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of looking harmless while being anything but. The story of what happened next would become legend in Millbrook, passed down through generations of customers who'd witnessed the day when their quiet waitress revealed her true nature. But that revelation was still hours away, building like a storm on the horizon while the town went about its normal business, unaware that everything was about to change. The next morning brought an unusual chill to Millbrook, the kind of early autumn cold that makes people reach for sweaters they'd forgotten they owned. Maria arrived at the diner 30 minutes earlier than usual, her breath visible in small puffs as she unlocked the back door. The building felt different somehow, as if the previous day's confrontation had left an invisible residue that changed the very air inside. She moved through her opening routine with the same methodical precision that had characterized her work for 8 years. But today, every action carried additional weight. The coffee she brewed would need to be perfect because customers would need comfort. The tables she cleaned gleamed with extra attention because normalcy was now a weapon against fear. The register she counted held money that might soon be demanded by people who had no right to it. Eddie arrived 20 minutes late, his usual punctuality disrupted by a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to pay extortion money he didn't have. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands shook slightly as he tied his apron, the weight of 48 hours pressing down on him like a physical burden. He'd called his wife 3 times during the night, each conversation ending with the same helpless conclusion that there were no good options available to them. The breakfast crowd trickled in more slowly than usual, and Maria noticed immediately that several regulars were missing. Word had traveled through Millbrook's efficient gossip network about the previous morning's visitors, and people were making their own calculations about whether Eddie's Corner Cafe was still a safe place to gather. The absence of familiar faces felt like small betrayals, though Maria understood the logic behind them. Tom Bradley arrived 15 minutes later than normal, his mailman's uniform slightly wrinkled as if he'd dressed in a hurry. He took his usual seat at the counter, but spent more time looking toward the front door than reading his newspaper. When Maria poured his coffee, she noticed that his hands trembled more than usual, and he'd forgotten to order his customary bacon with breakfast. The medication he took for anxiety wasn't designed to handle this kind of stress. Sarah Martinez appeared with Danny but chose a different table than her regular booth, selecting one that offered a clear view of both the front door and the rear exit. Her motherly instincts had identified potential danger, and she was unconsciously positioning herself to protect her child if the situation deteriorated. She ordered only coffee, leaving her son's high chair empty, despite having brought it from her car. Frank Morrison's retired cronies gathered at their usual round table, but their conversation lacked its normal vigor. Instead of solving the world's problems with confident pronouncements, they spoke in hushed tones about property values and whether it might be time to consider moving somewhere safer. Joe Brennan, the former fire chief, kept glancing toward the fire extinguisher mounted near the kitchen door, his trained eye automatically cataloging emergency equipment he hoped wouldn't be needed. The atmosphere in the diner felt thick with unspoken tension, conversations that died when Maria approached tables, meaningful looks exchanged between customers who'd known each other for decades. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, though none of them could say exactly what they expected. The uncertainty was perhaps worse than direct confrontation would have been. Eddie emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of scrambled eggs that he set down mechanically at table 4 before realizing that the customer had ordered pancakes. His concentration was shattered, his usual competence replaced by the distracted movements of someone whose mind was elsewhere. He apologized profusely to the customer, a traveling salesman who'd stopped for breakfast on his way to the county seat, but the man waved off the error with the kind of nervous smile that suggested he too had sensed something wrong with the morning's atmosphere. As the morning progressed, Maria began to notice things that others missed. A dark sedan had been parked across the street since she'd arrived, its occupants occasionally visible as silhouettes behind tinted windows. The phone had rung twice with calls where no one spoke when Eddie answered, just silence, followed by a gentle click that carried its own message. A man in work clothes had walked past the front windows 3 times in 30 minutes, each pass accompanied by a careful study of the interior layout. These were the kinds of details that most people would dismiss as coincidence, but Maria's training had taught her to recognize patterns that preceded violence. Someone was conducting surveillance, mapping the diner's routines, identifying vulnerabilities, and planning their next move. The 48-hour deadline was still more than a day away, but preparations were already underway for whatever would happen if Eddie refused to cooperate. Around 10:30, the morning rush began to wind down as customers finished their meals and headed off to work or appointments. The diner was never particularly busy between the breakfast and lunch crowds, making it an ideal time for private conversations or activities that required privacy. Maria found herself hyper-alert during these quiet periods, her senses tuned to detect the approach of unwelcome visitors. She was refilling the coffee machine when she heard the distinctive rumble of motorcycle engines approaching from the east. The sound grew louder as multiple bikes turned onto Main Street, their modified exhaust systems announcing their presence to everyone within a half-mile radius. Through the front windows, she could see at least 6 motorcycles cruising slowly past the diner, their riders wearing the same style of leather jackets that yesterday's visitors had sported. Eddie heard the engines too and emerged from the kitchen with a dish towel in his hands, his face pale as he recognized the implications. This wasn't a coincidence or a casual ride through town. The 3 men from yesterday had brought reinforcements, a show of force designed to demonstrate that resistance would be met with overwhelming response. The message was clear. Eddie was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely at their mercy. The motorcycles made 2 complete circuits of the block before parking in front of the hardware store next door. 6 men dismounted with theatrical precision, each movement calculated to maximize intimidation. They were all cut from the same cloth as yesterday's visitors, though these appeared to be higher in whatever hierarchy they represented. Their leather jackets bore patches and insignia that spoke of affiliations and achievements in criminal enterprises that most law-abiding citizens couldn't interpret. Maria continued her cleaning routine, but her positioning shifted subtly as she worked. She was no longer simply wiping tables, but arranging herself to maintain visual contact with the men outside, while keeping her hands free for immediate action. The coffee pot she carried could serve multiple purposes beyond serving beverages, and the seemingly random placement of chairs and menu stands created potential obstacles for anyone who might enter with hostile intentions. The remaining customers in the diner sensed the change in atmosphere without understanding its source. Tom Bradley folded his newspaper with nervous precision and left money on the counter before heading for the door, his departure accompanied by a mumbled excuse about needing to start his mail route. Sarah Martinez gathered up Danny and his belongings with efficient haste, avoiding eye contact with anyone as she made her exit through the rear door that led to the parking lot behind the building. Frank Morrison's table emptied completely, as the retired men suddenly remembered appointments they needed to keep or household chores that couldn't wait. Their departure felt like rats abandoning a sinking ship, though Maria understood their reasoning. These were men who'd lived through enough decades to recognize genuine danger when they saw it, and their survival instincts were telling them to find somewhere else to be. Within minutes, the diner was empty except for Maria and Eddie, the silence broken only by the humming of refrigeration units and the distant sound of motorcycle engines idling outside. Eddie stood behind the register with his hands gripping the counter so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, his breathing shallow and rapid as he tried to process what was happening to his life's work. Maria moved to the front windows and adjusted the Venetian blinds to get a better view of the men outside. They were clearly planning something, their body language suggesting discussion of tactics and timing. The leader from yesterday was among them, pointing toward the diner and gesturing in ways that left little doubt about his intentions. Whatever was about to happen would be more serious than the previous day's initial contact. The front door chimed as it opened, But instead of the expected invasion of leather-clad thugs, a single figure entered. It was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman whose gossip network kept Millbrook informed about everyone's business. She carried a large handbag and wore the kind of determined expression that suggested she had important information to share. Mrs. Henderson had lived in Millbrook for 73 years and had never been intimidated by anyone, from playground bullies in elementary school to the developers who'd tried to force her to sell her property for a shopping center. She walked directly to the counter where Eddie stood, her sensible shoes clicking against the linoleum with authoritative precision. Her message was brief but devastating. The men outside weren't just random criminals passing through town. They represented a larger organization that had been expanding its operations throughout the rural counties, targeting small businesses that couldn't afford professional security or legal protection. 3 other towns had already fallen under their control, their business owners now paying regular tribute in exchange for the privilege of staying open. More disturbing was Mrs. Henderson's information about local law enforcement. The county sheriff's department was understaffed and overwhelmed, their resources stretched thin across a territory that covered hundreds of square miles. The state police were focused on highway crimes and had little interest in what they considered minor extortion cases. Even if Eddie reported the threats, meaningful protection would be unlikely to arrive in time to prevent retaliation. Mrs. Ewell. Henderson had come to warn Eddie, but also to deliver a more personal message. Her own grandson worked as a mechanic in the county seat and had heard rumors about what happened to business owners who tried to resist. Property damage was the least serious consequence. People had been hospitalized. Families had been threatened. In one case, a restaurant owner who'd contacted the authorities had simply disappeared, his business subsequently taken over by new management, with obvious connections to the criminal organization. The elderly woman's revelations painted a picture of systematic corruption and intimidation that went far beyond a simple shakedown. This was organized crime with roots in larger urban areas, expanding into rural territory where law enforcement was weak and resistance was unlikely. Eddie's Corner Cafe wasn't being targeted randomly, but had been identified as part of a larger strategy to control the economic life of the entire region. As Mrs. Henderson finished speaking, the sound of motorcycle engines grew louder. The men outside were preparing to move, their engines revving in a synchronized display that was part intimidation and part coordination. Through the windows, Maria could see them mounting their bikes with military precision, each rider checking his equipment and positioning before the group moved as a unit. Eddie thanked Mrs. Henderson for the warning, though his voice carried the hollow tone of someone who'd just learned that his situation was far worse than he'd imagined. The elderly woman patted his arm with grandmotherly sympathy before making her own exit through the rear door, her departure timed to avoid the approaching confrontation. The motorcycles pulled up directly in front of the diner, their engines creating a wall of sound that made conversation impossible. 6 men dismounted and approached the front door with the kind of coordinated movement that suggested military or paramilitary training. These weren't random street criminals, but professionals who understood how to use fear as a weapon. Maria watched their approach with the analytical eye of someone who'd studied such tactics from both sides. She noted how they positioned themselves to control all sight lines into the diner, how they arranged their formation to maximize psychological impact, and how they moved with the confidence of people who'd done this many times before. Every detail of their approach was calculated to demonstrate overwhelming superiority and the futility of resistance. The leader from yesterday entered first, his companions following in a precise order that spoke of hierarchy and discipline. They arranged themselves around the diner with practiced efficiency, each man taking a position that served both tactical and psychological purposes. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was not only futile, but would be met with consequences that extended far beyond property damage. Eddie stood frozen behind the counter as the leader approached, his body language that of a man who'd run out of options and hope. The conversation that followed was brief and brutal in its simplicity. The terms hadn't changed, but the timeline had. Eddie now had until the end of business today to produce the first payment, and the amount had doubled to account for the inconvenience of having to make a return visit. The leader's tone carried the casual menace of someone accustomed to compliance, his words delivered with the confidence of a man who'd never met serious resistance. He spoke about consequences in vague terms that were somehow more threatening than specific threats would have been. Property could be damaged, employees could be hurt, customers could find themselves unwelcome. The diner could suffer unfortunate accidents that would make continuing business impossible. Eddie tried to explain that he didn't have access to that kind of money, that the diner barely generated enough profit to cover expenses and salaries. His protestations were met with indifference that bordered on amusement. The men weren't interested in his financial situation beyond its usefulness as leverage. If he couldn't pay, then he would need to find creative ways to generate the required funds, perhaps by selling equipment or borrowing against his property. As the conversation continued, Maria moved through her cleaning routine with mechanical precision, but her positioning was anything but random. She was creating clear fields of fire while identifying potential weapons and cover positions. The seemingly innocent act of straightening chairs and wiping tables was actually battlefield preparation conducted under the noses of people who considered her beneath notice. The leader's attention finally turned to Maria as she worked near their table, his eyes appraising her with the casual dismissal that men like him reserve for people they considered insignificant. He made a comment about Eddie's employee, suggesting that someone so obviously harmless wouldn't be able to provide protection if things turned unpleasant. His companions laughed at the observation, their mirth carrying an undertone of cruelty that suggested they enjoyed the fear they created. Maria continued her work without acknowledging the comment, her face maintaining the same neutral expression she'd worn for 8 years of serving coffee and taking orders. To anyone watching, she appeared to be exactly what she seemed, a middle-aged waitress trying to stay invisible, while dangerous men conducted business that didn't concern her. The performance was flawless, because it was based on truth. She was invisible to them, which would prove to be their greatest mistake. The conversation between Eddie and the criminals continued for another 10 minutes, each exchange driving home the hopelessness of his situation. They weren't interested in negotiation or compromise, only compliance. The protection they offered was protection from themselves, a classic extortion scheme that had been refined over decades of criminal enterprise. Eddie would pay or face consequences that would destroy everything he'd built. As the men prepared to leave, the leader delivered his final ultimatum with the kind of theatrical flourish that was designed to eliminate any hope of escape. Eddie had until 6 o'clock that evening to produce the first payment. If he failed to comply, if he contacted law enforcement, or if he tried to leave town, there would be immediate and severe retaliation. The diner would burn. Eddie would be hurt. His employees would become targets. His wife would discover that small towns offered no protection from people who were determined to collect what they considered their due. The 6 men filed out of the diner with the same coordinated precision they'd shown entering, their departure accompanied by the roar of motorcycle engines that announced their presence to everyone within miles. They rode past the front window slowly, each man turning to stare through the glass with expressions that promised violence if their demands weren't met. Eddie collapsed into the nearest chair as soon as they were gone, his body finally succumbing to the stress that had been building since yesterday morning. His face was gray and slick with perspiration, his breathing labored as if he'd just completed a marathon. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in completely. He was trapped between impossible demands and unacceptable consequences. Maria moved to his side and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her touch conveying sympathy and support. But behind her concerned expression, her mind was working with the precision of a chess master considering her next several moves. The time for passive observation had ended. The threat had escalated beyond what she could allow to continue. She helped Eddie to his feet and guided him to the office behind the kitchen, where she poured him a glass of water and encouraged him to sit quietly while she handled the lunch preparation. Her voice carried the same gentle authority she'd used to manage difficult customers, but there was an undertone that Eddie couldn't quite identify. Something had changed in Maria's demeanor, though he was too overwhelmed to analyze what that change might mean. As Eddie tried to compose himself in the office, Maria returned to the main dining area and began her real work. She moved through the space with purposeful efficiency, no longer simply cleaning but preparing. She checked sight lines and cover positions, identified potential weapons and defensive positions, and began the mental calculations that would determine how the next few hours would unfold. The lunch crowd would arrive soon, and Maria needed to ensure that innocent people wouldn't be caught in whatever was about to happen. She flipped the sign on the front door to "closed" and pulled down the window shades, creating privacy for activities that required darkness. She moved chairs and tables to create specific patterns that would channel movement and limit options for anyone who entered uninvited. From her purse, she retrieved a small device that looked like an ordinary cell phone but served purposes that went far beyond communication. She scrolled through contacts that hadn't been used in years, numbers that connected her to people who understood violence and were willing to provide assistance to old friends who found themselves in difficult situations. Her finger hovered over several names before selecting one that would be both effective and discreet. The conversation was brief and conducted in a language that wasn't Spanish, though anyone overhearing might have assumed that's what they were listening to. Maria provided location, timeline, and threat assessment in terms that were both precise and coded. The voice on the other end acknowledged her request with professional efficiency, promising resources that would arrive within hours. As she ended the call, Maria realized that she was crossing a line she'd hoped never to approach again. The quiet life she'd built in Millbrook was about to end, replaced by something that would reveal capabilities she'd spent 8 years keeping hidden. But some things were worth protecting, and Eddie's Corner Cafe had become one of those things. The afternoon passed slowly as Maria prepared for what was coming. She sent Eddie home early, convincing him that he needed time to think clearly about his options. She called the other employees and told them to take the day off, citing a gas leak that required professional attention. By 3 o'clock, the diner was empty except for Maria, who was making final preparations for visitors who would arrive, believing they held all the advantages. She changed clothes in the small restroom, trading her uniform for dark clothing that would be more suitable for activities that required mobility and stealth. From a hiding place that no one else knew existed, she retrieved items that transformed her from a waitress into something much more dangerous. The transformation was both physical and psychological, years of peaceful routine falling away to reveal the person she'd been before Millbrook. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Maria took her position near the front door and waited. The 6 men would return at 6 o'clock, expecting to collect their money from a defeated business owner who'd had no choice but to submit to their demands. Instead, they would discover that they'd made a fundamental error in their assessment of the situation. The shy waitress who'd served coffee for 8 years was about to remind the world that appearances could be deceiving in ways that proved fatal to those who relied too heavily on assumptions. The transformation was complete, and Millbrook was about to witness something that would become legend in the years that followed. The clock above the coffee machine showed 5:47 when the rumble of engines announced their return. Maria stood behind the counter in her dark clothing, her posture relaxed, but her senses hyper-alert as 6 motorcycles pulled up outside Eddie's Corner Cafe. The riders dismounted with the same coordinated precision they'd displayed that morning, their movements betraying the confidence of predators who'd never encountered meaningful resistance. The leader pushed through the front door first, his eyes immediately noting the darkened interior and the absence of other customers. He called out for Eddie in a voice that carried across the empty diner, expecting immediate compliance from a man who should have been waiting with payment in hand. When no response came, he gestured for his companions to spread out and search the building. Maria stepped out from behind the counter, her movement drawing their attention like a magnet. In the dim light filtering through the closed blinds, she appeared exactly as she had for 8 years, an unremarkable middle-aged woman in simple clothing. The leader's eyes swept over her with dismissive recognition, filing her under the category of insignificant obstacles that could be easily managed. He demanded to know where Eddie was, his tone carrying the irritation of someone whose schedule had been disrupted by incompetence. Maria responded in the same soft voice she'd used to take coffee orders, explaining that Eddie had stepped out but would return shortly. Her manner was apologetic and submissive, exactly what the men expected from someone in her position. The leader's patience evaporated with visible fury. He grabbed Maria by the arm with enough force to leave bruises, his grip designed to demonstrate his power over someone he considered helpless. He pulled her closer, his face inches from hers as he explained what happened to people who wasted his time. His breath carried the stale odor of cigarettes and cheap whiskey, his eyes holding the flat emptiness that characterized men who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Maria allowed herself to be manhandled, her body language suggesting fear and submission while her mind cataloged every detail of his positioning. She noted the weight distribution that favored his right leg, the slight tremor in his left hand that suggested either drugs or medical issues, and the way his jacket hung that indicated weapons carried in specific locations. Her years of training had taught her to read opponents like books, and this man was revealing more information than he realized. The other 5 men had spread throughout the diner, their search revealing the absence of both Eddie and the expected payment. Their frustration was palpable as they realized they'd walked into a situation that wasn't proceeding according to their carefully laid plans. One of them discovered that the cash register was empty, its contents removed before their arrival. Another found that the office door was locked, the small space behind the kitchen sealed against intrusion. The leader's grip on Maria's arm tightened as his anger escalated. He began explaining what would happen to Eddie when they found him, his descriptions graphic enough to make hardened criminals uncomfortable. He spoke about broken bones and damaged property, about consequences that would extend to family members and employees. His words were chosen to terrorize, each threat calibrated to maximize psychological impact. Maria listened with apparent horror, her face showing exactly the kind of fear that men like him fed upon. But behind her frightened expression, she was making final calculations about timing and positioning. The 6 men had arranged themselves in a formation that seemed tactically sound but actually created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood their weaknesses. The youngest member of the group, barely out of his teens with nervous energy that suggested inexperience, had positioned himself near the kitchen door. His weapon was visible beneath his jacket, but his stance indicated he'd never used it in actual combat. The 2 men by the front windows were blocking their own escape route while limiting their fields of fire. The older man near the back booth had claimed the high ground but sacrificed mobility in the process. As the leader continued his tirade, Maria began to move with subtle shifts that appeared to be nervous fidgeting but actually served tactical purposes. She was creating distance from the most dangerous opponent while positioning herself to neutralize multiple threats in rapid sequence. Her movements were so gradual and seemingly involuntary that none of the men noticed the chess game she was playing. The transformation began when the leader made a critical error in judgment. Frustrated by Maria's apparent helplessness and Eddie's absence, he decided to send a message that would motivate cooperation. He released her arm and reached for the coffee pot that sat on the heating element behind the counter, his intention clearly to use scalding liquid as an instrument of torture. His hand never reached its target. Maria's movement was so fast that the human eye could barely track it. One moment she was cowering under his verbal assault, and the next she had broken his wrist with a precision strike that severed tendons and shattered bone. The coffee pot he'd been reaching for became a weapon in her hands, its contents launched with surgical accuracy toward the youngest gang member who was fumbling for his concealed firearm. The scalding liquid caught him full in the face, his scream echoing through the diner as he clawed at his eyes and stumbled blindly toward the kitchen door. But Maria was already moving, her body flowing through space with the kind of economy of motion that spoke of training that went far beyond self-defense classes at the local community center. The 2 men by the front windows turned toward the commotion, their hands reaching for weapons they would never have the chance to draw. Maria covered the distance between them in heartbeats, her attack pattern, designed to incapacitate rather than kill, but effective enough to eliminate threats permanently. The first man went down with a crushed larynx that would prevent him from calling for help. The second found himself unconscious before he could process what was happening to his partner. The older man at the back booth had managed to clear his weapon, a snub-nosed revolver that he held with the competence of someone who'd used firearms in anger. But Maria was no longer where his eyes expected her to be, her movement pattern creating confusion about her location and intention. She appeared at his side like a ghost, her hands working with clinical precision to disarm him before applying pressure to nerve clusters that dropped him like a felled tree. The remaining 2 gang members, veterans who'd survived street fights and gang wars, found themselves facing an opponent who operated according to rules they didn't understand. One of them managed to draw a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light as he lunged toward where Maria had been standing. But she was already behind him, her counterattack swift and decisive enough to render him unconscious without permanent damage. The final gang member, the one who'd served as the leader's lieutenant during their morning intimidation campaign, demonstrated the wisdom that had kept him alive through years of criminal activity. Instead of trying to fight an opponent who'd just neutralized 5 armed men in less than 30 seconds, he raised his hands in surrender and backed slowly toward the front door. Maria allowed him to reach the entrance before speaking for the first time since the violence had begun. Her voice carried a different quality now, stripped of the submissive tone she'd maintained for 8 years. There was authority in her words, the kind of quiet confidence that came from absolute certainty about her capabilities and his limitations. She told him that he would leave Millbrook immediately and never return. He would inform his organization that Eddie's Corner Cafe was under protection that extended far beyond local law enforcement. He would explain that any further attempts to collect extortion money would result in consequences that made tonight's demonstration seem gentle by comparison. Most importantly, he would ensure that word spread through criminal networks about what happened to people who threatened this particular establishment. The surviving gang member needed no further encouragement to comply with her instructions. He stumbled through the front door with the desperate haste of someone who'd glimpsed his own mortality and found it wanting. His motorcycle started on the first try, its engine roaring as he fled toward the highway with the kind of speed that suggested he understood the fragility of his continued existence. Maria stood among the unconscious bodies scattered across the diner floor, her breathing barely elevated despite the violence she'd just unleashed. She moved through the aftermath with methodical precision, checking pulses and ensuring that her restraint had been as exact as her violence. All 5 men were alive but would require medical attention for injuries that would heal with time and proper care. From her pocket, she retrieved the device she'd used earlier to make her coded phone call. A brief conversation in the same foreign language confirmed that cleanup assistance was en route, along with transportation for the unconscious gang members who would wake up in a location far from Millbrook with clear instructions about their future behavior. As she waited for her associates to arrive, Maria began the process of restoring the diner to its normal appearance. The overturned chairs were righted, the spilled coffee cleaned up, the evidence of violence systematically erased. By the time Eddie returned the next morning, there would be no indication that anything unusual had occurred in his establishment. The first of her old contacts arrived within 20 minutes, a woman roughly Maria's age who moved with the same deadly efficiency that characterized professional operators. She surveyed the scene with analytical eyes, noting the precision with which the threats had been neutralized and the care taken to minimize permanent damage. Her nod of approval carried the weight of recognition between equals who understood the requirements of their shared profession. Additional personnel arrived in vehicles that bore no distinctive markings but served purposes that went far beyond civilian transportation. The unconscious gang members were loaded with medical care that ensured their survival while guaranteeing they would remember enough of their experience to serve as effective messengers. Their motorcycles disappeared into trailers that would transport them to locations where they could be discovered by authorities with plausible explanations for their condition. Throughout the cleanup operation, Maria worked alongside people who knew her by a different name and understood capabilities that Millbrook had never suspected. They addressed her with the respect accorded to legends, their deference indicating a reputation that extended far beyond a single evening's work. These were professionals who'd operated in shadows around the world, and they recognized Maria as someone whose accomplishments exceeded their own. The operation concluded with the kind of thoroughness that characterized intelligence work at the highest levels. Every surface was cleaned, every piece of evidence removed, every detail addressed to ensure that official investigations would find nothing to investigate. The diner was restored to exactly the condition it had been in before the evening's visitors had arrived, with one significant difference. It was now under protection that extended far beyond anything local authorities could provide. As the last of her associates departed, Maria found herself alone in the diner that had been her sanctuary for 8 years. She changed back into her uniform, returning to the appearance of the shy waitress who'd served coffee and pie to customers who thought they knew her. But the transformation she'd undergone couldn't be completely reversed. Lines had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, and her quiet life in Millbrook had been forever altered. She spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing for Eddie's return, ensuring that everything would appear normal when he arrived to open for breakfast. The coffee was freshly brewed, the tables clean and properly set, the register counted and ready for the day's business. But Maria herself was different, her posture carrying subtle changes that spoke of capabilities no longer hidden. Eddie arrived at his usual time, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night spent contemplating impossible choices. He moved through the diner like a man walking to his execution, his eyes noting details he'd been too distracted to observe the previous evening. The absence of motorcycle tracks outside the front door, the pristine condition of the interior, the complete lack of evidence that 6 armed criminals had visited his establishment with violent intentions. Maria greeted him with the same gentle smile she'd worn for 8 years, but Eddie found himself studying her face with new attention. There was something different about her expression, a quality of confidence that hadn't been there before. When she assured him that his problems had been resolved, her voice carried an authority that made him believe her, despite the logical impossibility of her claim. The breakfast crowd arrived with their usual punctuality, but the atmosphere in the diner had subtly changed. Customers who'd avoided the establishment the previous day returned with sheepish apologies and larger-than-usual tips. Tom Bradley resumed his regular schedule, his newspaper once again holding his attention instead of being used to monitor the front door for threatening visitors. Sarah Martinez brought Danny back to their regular booth, her maternal instincts no longer detecting danger in the familiar environment. Frank Morrison's table filled with the usual collection of retired men who possessed encyclopedic knowledge of local gossip and regional history. Their conversation gradually returned to its normal topics: weather patterns, political developments, and the eternal debate about whether the proposed shopping center would help or hurt local businesses. The tension that had characterized recent discussions gradually dissipated as they sensed that whatever threat had been hanging over their community had somehow been resolved. Throughout the morning, Eddie found himself watching Maria with growing amazement. She moved through her duties with the same efficiency she'd always displayed, but there were subtle differences in her bearing that suggested capabilities he'd never suspected. When she handled difficult customers, her quiet authority seemed more pronounced. When she managed multiple orders during the breakfast rush, her organizational skills appeared almost supernatural. When she interacted with law enforcement officers who stopped by for coffee, her conversation suggested familiarity with procedures and protocols that extended beyond civilian experience. The most significant change became apparent when Sheriff Deputy Collins arrived for his usual mid-morning coffee break. Maria engaged him in conversation about recent security concerns in the area, her questions demonstrating knowledge of criminal organizations and investigative procedures that surprised both the deputy and Eddie. Her suggestions about improved patrol patterns and community watch programs carried the weight of professional expertise rather than civilian speculation. Deputy Collins found himself taking notes as Maria outlined security vulnerabilities he hadn't considered and proposed solutions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of law enforcement challenges. Her analysis of regional crime patterns was so comprehensive that he began to suspect she had access to information sources that weren't available to local authorities. By the time he left the diner, he was treating Maria with the kind of respect usually reserved for fellow professionals. The lunch crowd brought its own confirmation that Millbrook had returned to normal. Customers lingered over their meals instead of eating quickly and departing. Conversations resumed their normal volume and content instead of the whispered speculation that had characterized recent days. Children accompanied their parents without the kind of protective hovering that had become common since the gang's initial appearance. Mrs. Henderson arrived with her usual determination to share important information, but today her news was positive rather than alarming. Her network of contacts had reported that the criminal organization that had been targeting local businesses appeared to have shifted their attention to other areas. Several witnesses claimed to have seen motorcycles heading toward the interstate at high speed the previous evening, their riders apparently abandoning whatever plans they'd had for Millbrook. More intriguingly, Mrs. Henderson had heard rumors from contacts in the county seat about gang members appearing at a hospital emergency room with injuries they claimed resulted from a motorcycle accident. Their stories were inconsistent, and their behavior suggested they were more concerned with leaving the area than receiving proper medical treatment. Law enforcement authorities were investigating, but the gang members had provided false identification and disappeared before proper questioning could be conducted. Eddie listened to Mrs. Henderson's report with growing amazement, his eyes seeking Maria's face for some explanation of events he couldn't understand. She continued her duties with unruffled calm, her expression giving no indication that she knew more about recent developments than anyone else in the diner. But Eddie was beginning to recognize that his quiet waitress possessed depths he'd never imagined. The afternoon passed peacefully, with customers gradually abandoning the hypervigilance that had characterized their behavior since the gang's initial appearance. The diner resumed its role as the community's informal social center, where news was shared, relationships maintained, and the daily business of small-town life was conducted over coffee and conversation. As closing time approached, Eddie finally worked up the courage to ask Maria directly about the previous evening's events. Her response was delivered in the same soft voice she'd used to take orders for 8 years. But her words carried implications that made his head spin. She explained that some problems resolved themselves when approached with the right kind of assistance. She mentioned that her previous experience in customer service had taught her how to handle difficult situations. She noted that communities were stronger when they protected each other from outside threats. Everything she said was technically true, but Eddie understood that he was hearing only the surface of a much deeper story. Maria Santos, the shy waitress who'd served coffee for 8 years, had somehow arranged for the elimination of a threat that had seemed insurmountable. The methods she'd employed and the resources she'd accessed remained mysterious, but the results spoke for themselves. As they prepared to close the diner for the day, Eddie found himself looking at Maria with new appreciation and a healthy dose of wariness. He'd spent 8 years thinking he knew everything important about his most reliable employee, only to discover that she possessed capabilities that extended far beyond taking orders and serving meals. The realization was both comforting and unsettling, like learning that a friendly neighbor was actually a retired superhero. Maria finished her closing routine with the same methodical precision she'd always displayed, but Eddie now recognized that her attention to detail served purposes beyond simple cleanliness. She was conducting security sweeps, monitoring sightlines, and maintaining situational awareness that would have impressed military professionals. Her transformation from harmless waitress to protective guardian had been so subtle that he was only now beginning to understand what had been hidden in plain sight. The evening shadows lengthened across Main Street as they prepared to lock up the diner that had been saved by methods Eddie couldn't comprehend but was deeply grateful to have experienced. Tomorrow would bring another normal day in Millbrook, with customers who took their safety for granted and never suspected how close they'd come to losing a cherished gathering place. But Eddie would remember this day for the rest of his life, not just as the moment when his business was saved from criminal extortion, but as his introduction to the extraordinary woman who'd been serving his coffee while concealing secrets that could reshape his understanding of what was possible in their quiet corner of the world. 3 months later, Eddie's Corner Cafe had become something of a pilgrimage site for law enforcement officers from across the region. Word had spread through official channels about the establishment, where a gang extortion attempt had simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind only medical reports of injured criminals who refused to discuss their experiences. The mysterious resolution had captured the attention of federal agencies that specialized in organized crime, though their investigations yielded nothing more substantial than rumors and speculation. Maria continued her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her work for 8 years, but perceptive customers began to notice subtle changes in how she was treated by visitors who carried themselves with unmistakable authority. FBI agents conducting routine interviews spoke to her with unusual deference. State police investigators sought her opinions on security matters that seemed beyond the scope of waitressing. Even the county sheriff began consulting her about crime patterns and prevention strategies, treating her insights as if they came from a trusted colleague rather than a civilian observer. The transformation in Millbrook's crime statistics was remarkable enough to attract academic attention from criminologists studying rural security trends. Property crimes had decreased by 70% since the incident at the diner. Drug-related arrests had dropped to nearly zero, as dealers apparently decided to conduct business elsewhere. Even minor offenses like vandalism and public intoxication had become increasingly rare, as if the entire criminal element had received a collective message about the wisdom of avoiding the area. Eddie found himself fielding inquiries from restaurant owners in neighboring towns who wanted to know his secret for maintaining such a peaceful establishment. Business consultants arrived to study his operation, convinced that he'd developed innovative security measures that could be replicated elsewhere. Insurance companies offered premium reductions based on his remarkable safety record. Local politicians used his diner as an example of successful community policing, though they couldn't explain exactly what made his approach so effective. The truth was that Maria had become the unofficial guardian of a much larger territory than just the diner itself. Her network of contacts provided intelligence about criminal activities throughout the region, allowing problems to be addressed before they fully developed. Suspicious individuals found themselves subjected to the kind of scrutiny that made Millbrook an unattractive destination for illegal enterprises. Drug dealers discovered that their supply chains were mysteriously disrupted whenever they attempted to establish operations in the area. Frank Morrison's table had evolved into an informal intelligence gathering center, though the retired men who occupied it never suspected their conversations were being carefully monitored and analyzed. Maria learned about domestic disputes before they escalated to violence, financial problems before they drove people to desperate measures, and social tensions before they exploded into criminal behavior. Armed with this knowledge, she could arrange for appropriate interventions that prevented crimes, rather than simply responding to them after the fact. The most significant change in Maria's routine came through her relationship with local high school students who worked part-time at the diner. She began mentoring them in ways that went far beyond job training, teaching lessons about situational awareness, conflict resolution, and personal safety that would serve them throughout their lives. Her guidance was subtle but comprehensive, delivered through casual conversations that planted seeds of wisdom about recognizing and avoiding dangerous situations. One of these students, Jenny Rodriguez, had been struggling with harassment from an ex-boyfriend who refused to accept their breakup. Maria recognized the warning signs of escalating domestic violence and took action that was both decisive and invisible. The young man suddenly found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from authorities who seemed to know about every minor infraction he'd ever committed. When he finally left town to attend college in another state, his departure appeared to be a natural consequence of his academic plans rather than the result of pressure he couldn't identify or resist. Another student, Marcus Thompson, had been drifting toward involvement with drug dealers who recruited teenagers as distributors and lookouts. Maria arranged for him to receive information about scholarship opportunities that would take him away from negative influences while providing positive direction for his future. The dealers who'd been targeting him found their own operations subject to disruptions that made recruiting local youth an unprofitable endeavor. These interventions created ripple effects throughout the community that strengthened social bonds and reduced the vulnerabilities that criminal organizations typically exploited. Families became more cohesive as stressors were addressed before they could cause permanent damage. Young people found positive outlets for their energy and ambition rather than falling into destructive patterns. Business owners operated with confidence that their investments were protected by security measures they couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The regional crime syndicate that had been expanding into rural areas found Millbrook to be an increasingly expensive and dangerous place to conduct business. Attempts to establish drug distribution networks were met with law enforcement responses that seemed impossibly well-informed about their activities. Efforts to recruit local muscle were thwarted by potential collaborators, who suddenly developed better opportunities elsewhere. Even simple crimes like burglary and theft became problematic, as criminals discovered that their targets were protected by security measures that defied explanation. Eventually, the syndicate leadership made the pragmatic decision to redirect their expansion efforts toward areas that offered better risk-to-reward ratios. Millbrook and its surrounding communities were classified as hostile territory to be avoided rather than conquered. The designation spread through criminal networks with the efficiency of a virus, creating a protective barrier around the region that was maintained through reputation rather than visible force. Maria's influence extended beyond crime prevention to economic development, as the region's improved safety record began attracting legitimate investment. The proposed shopping center moved forward, with enthusiastic support from developers who appreciated the area's stability. A small manufacturing company relocated from an urban area plagued by security problems, bringing jobs and tax revenue to the county. Tourism increased as visitors discovered a destination where they could enjoy rural attractions without worrying about their personal safety. Eddie's Diner became the unofficial headquarters for these positive developments, its role as a community center enhanced by its reputation as a place where important conversations happened and significant decisions were made. Business deals were negotiated over coffee and pie. Local government officials held informal meetings at corner tables. Community leaders gathered to plan festivals and improvements that would benefit everyone who lived in the area. The success story attracted attention from federal agencies that specialized in community policing and crime prevention. Researchers arrived to study what they termed the Millbrook model of rural security. Though their investigations never uncovered the true source of the area's transformation, their reports credited community engagement, effective law enforcement partnerships, and innovative business practices for creating an environment that was naturally resistant to criminal infiltration. Maria cooperated with these studies while revealing nothing about her actual methods or resources. She presented herself as a longtime resident who'd simply been fortunate to work in an establishment that served as a natural gathering place for community members. Her insights about social dynamics and crime prevention were attributed to years of observing human behavior from behind a coffee counter rather than professional training in intelligence analysis and threat assessment. The academic attention brought grant money and federal programs designed to replicate Millbrook's success in other rural communities. Maria found herself consulted about these initiatives, her recommendations carefully disguised as common-sense observations rather than tactical expertise. She suggested approaches that would strengthen community bonds, improve information sharing, and create early warning systems for potential problems, all while maintaining the appearance of civilian involvement rather than professional security planning. As the first anniversary of the gang incident approached, Eddie finally worked up the courage to ask Maria directly about her background and the mysterious events that had transformed their lives. Her response was delivered with the same gentle smile she'd worn throughout 8 years of serving coffee, but her words carried layers of meaning that left him with more questions than answers. She spoke about the importance of protecting communities from external threats, about the value of quiet service that asked for no recognition, and about the satisfaction that came from helping good people live peaceful lives. She mentioned previous experience in customer service that had taught her how to handle difficult situations and challenging personalities. She noted that everyone had hidden depths that were revealed only when circumstances demanded exceptional responses. Everything she said was true, but Eddie understood that he was hearing only fragments of a much larger story. Maria Santos had spent 8 years serving coffee while maintaining capabilities that could reshape criminal activities across an entire region. Her methods remained mysterious, her resources unknown, and her true identity carefully hidden behind the persona of a shy waitress who wanted nothing more than to help her neighbors live safely. The revelation that she intended to continue her work indefinitely brought Eddie a mixture of relief and wonder. His diner would remain under protection that extended far beyond anything money could buy. His community would continue to benefit from security measures that operated in shadows but produced results that were visible to everyone. His employees and customers would be safe from threats they would never know existed because someone had decided their welfare was worth protecting. On quiet mornings when the breakfast rush was over and the lunch crowd hadn't yet arrived, Eddie sometimes found himself studying Maria as she went about her duties. She remained the same person who'd applied for a waitressing job 8 years ago, seeking nothing more than honest work in a peaceful environment. But she was also something else entirely, a guardian whose presence had transformed their corner of the world into a place where good people could thrive without fear. The story of what had happened at Eddie's Corner Cafe would never be fully told, its details remaining classified in files that most people weren't authorized to know existed. But its effects would ripple outward for generations, creating a legacy of safety and prosperity that began with one woman's decision to protect something worth preserving. Maria Santos had found her true calling in the most unlikely place, serving coffee while serving justice in ways that would never be acknowledged, but would never be forgotten by those who benefited from her invisible vigilance. In the end, the shy waitress had proven that the most powerful forces for good often worked in silence, asking for no credit while ensuring that others could sleep peacefully at night. Her transformation from hidden operative to community protector was complete, and Millbrook would never be the same. 5 years had passed since that autumn evening when everything changed, and Maria Santos stood in the same spot behind the counter where she'd faced down 6 armed criminals with nothing but her bare hands and decades of training. The diner looked exactly the same, from the worn linoleum floors to the humming coffee machines, but the woman who'd once hidden her true nature had evolved into something entirely different. She was no longer pretending to be just a waitress. The cover story had become unnecessary as her reputation spread through law enforcement circles, turning her into a legend whose real name was whispered with reverence in federal briefing rooms. Maria Santos had become a symbol of what one person could accomplish when they chose to stand between predators and innocent people. The morning crowd included familiar faces alongside newcomers who'd heard stories about the woman who served the best coffee in 3 counties, while maintaining the safest community in the state. Tom Bradley still read his paper at the counter, but now he worked as a liaison between the Postal Service and Homeland Security, his route providing intelligence about suspicious activities throughout the region. Sarah Martinez had returned from nursing school to open a medical clinic that served as an unofficial safe house for domestic violence survivors. Frank Morrison's table had become legendary among law enforcement professionals as the place where the most accurate intelligence about criminal activities was discussed over bottomless cups of coffee. The retired men who gathered there had evolved into an informal network of observers whose combined knowledge covered every aspect of life in their expanded territory. Eddie had embraced his role as proprietor of what federal agencies quietly referred to as the most secure civilian establishment in the rural United States. His diner served as an unofficial meeting place for operations that required absolute discretion, its reputation for safety making it a natural choice for sensitive conversations that couldn't happen in government buildings. The transformation was complete when Maria received an unexpected visitor on a Tuesday morning in late spring. The woman who entered moved with the kind of careful precision that marked her as someone accustomed to dangerous environments. Her appearance unremarkable enough to blend into any crowd while her eyes missed nothing important about her surroundings. She introduced herself to Eddie as Agent Catherine Hayes from a federal agency whose acronym he didn't recognize. But her real business was with Maria. The conversation that followed was conducted in low tones that didn't carry beyond their corner booth, but Eddie caught enough fragments to understand that his waitress was being offered something extraordinary. The position was described in vague terms that suggested responsibilities extending far beyond anything a small town could provide. There would be resources at her disposal that could amplify her protective capabilities to a national scale. The work would be officially recognized for the first time in her career, with acknowledgement and support from the highest levels of government. Maria's response was delivered without hesitation or regret. She thanked Agent Hayes for the honor of being considered, but explained that her duty was here, in this diner, protecting this community. She had found something worth preserving in the simple act of serving coffee to people who deserve to live without fear. The federal agent's surprise was evident as she processed the rejection of an opportunity that most intelligence professionals would consider the pinnacle of their careers. Maria's explanation was patient but firm. She had spent decades moving through shadows and operating in isolation, but Millbrook had given her something she'd never experienced: the chance to protect people who knew and valued her as a person, rather than just as an asset. Agent Hayes departed with obvious reluctance, leaving behind a business card that would provide direct access to resources if Maria ever changed her mind. But both women understood that the conversation was unlikely to be repeated. Maria Santos had found her true calling in the most unlikely place, and no government position could offer anything more valuable than what she'd already built. The afternoon brought confirmation that Maria's influence had created something unique in American law enforcement history. A delegation of international observers arrived to study what academic papers had begun calling the Millbrook Protocol for Community-Based Security. Representatives from countries struggling with rural crime wanted to understand how a single individual had transformed an entire region's safety profile. Maria cooperated with their research while maintaining the fiction that her contributions were limited to civilian observation and common-sense recommendations. She demonstrated how community engagement could create early warning systems for criminal activity, how economic development could eliminate the desperation that drove people toward illegal enterprises, and how social cohesion could make entire populations resistant to external threats. The visitors left with detailed reports about community policing initiatives, business partnership programs, and social support networks that had somehow created an environment where serious crime was virtually impossible. Their documentation would influence policy decisions in capitals around the world, though none of them suspected that the soft-spoken waitress who'd served their coffee possessed capabilities that exceeded those of their own intelligence services. As evening approached and the last customers departed, Eddie found himself alone with Maria for what had become their traditional end-of-day conversation. These talks had evolved into something approaching friendship between people who shared secrets that couldn't be discussed with anyone else. Tonight's conversation was different because both of them understood that a chapter was ending, even as another began. Maria's work in Millbrook was complete in ways that mattered most. The community was secure, the criminal threats neutralized, and the systems she'd put in place capable of maintaining themselves without her direct intervention. But rather than moving on to new challenges, Maria had chosen to stay and tend the garden she'd planted. Her decision to remain in Millbrook represented something unprecedented in the world of intelligence operations. An agent who'd found a mission worth completing with her entire life, rather than moving from assignment to assignment. Eddie poured 2 cups of coffee and joined her at the counter where she'd stood guard over their community for so many years. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over Main Street while understanding that tomorrow would bring another day of serving coffee while serving something far more important. The shy waitress who'd hidden her true nature for 8 years had become Maria Santos, the woman who'd chosen to spend her extraordinary abilities on ordinary people who deserved extraordinary protection. Her transformation was complete, her mission ongoing, and her legacy already secured in the countless lives that were safer because she'd decided their welfare was worth a lifetime of dedicated service. Somewhere in the distance, a car backfired, and Maria's head turned toward the sound with reflexes that would never completely fade. But the threat assessment was automatic and brief, her trained instincts confirming what her heart already knew. Millbrook was safe, its people protected, and her work exactly where it needed to be. The story would continue for as long as Maria chose to make it continue, with new chapters written in the simple act of pouring coffee for people who mattered more than any mission file could ever convey. She had found her true calling in the most unlikely place, and she intended to honor it for the rest of her life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.